Our topic this afternoon.
This is jiggling.
No. Use my microphone. Our topic this afternoon is allyship is a two-way street. And I am utterly delighted to be in the presence of really, really firm allies. I'm going to introduce them each before they speak, but just briefly, immediately to my right is Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay. Stephanie has been an ally and a troublemaker with me for many years here at JTS. She is the Associate Dean of the Department of Religious Leadership. When I was a student here, we called it Rabbinical School. Father McManus has been a friend in dialogue for many, many years. He's an extraordinary thinker, speaker, theologian. I'll give a more formal introduction just before he speaks, but I do want to say one thing. He's a very powerful speaker. The last time we were on a panel together, Dennis was so powerful that the skies darkened when he was finished. So just be ready. Lisa Jenkins Brown, Dr. Lisa Jenkins Brown is our neighbor here. She is a senior minister of a church in Harlem, the first woman to hold that position. I've known Lisa so long that she was still Lisa Jenkins when I first met her. But we're in a study group together, and we just are thrilled to have our neighbor in our house. And last but not least, my buddy Hussein Rashid. I will talk more about him formally. He's got many impressive qualifications to be here. But we literally have traveled the world together to do dialogue. I think the most exotic maybe was in Oman. Yes. Yeah. So Hussein and my wife went wandering the shuk in Oman. So it's just, I feel that I'm here among friends. And I'm telling you this because I am aware of the fact that at some points our dialogue today might grow a little heated. And that's good because we do this as a dialogue of love, of friendship, and we know that at the end of the day we can disagree about terribly important things and still leave the room as friends. So I've invited each of the speakers to open with about 10 minutes, 9 minutes, maybe 11 minutes. And we're going to start with Father Dennis McManus. He is a priest of the Archdiocese of Mobile, Alabama. He is also the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Consultant for Jewish Affairs and on the Vatican Baptist Dialogue and the USCCB Reformed Churches Dialogue. Father McManus has taught courses in theology, medieval literature, classic languages, and for our purposes, most important, at least to me, Jewish studies for over 40 years. He just completed a 25-year stint as professor in the Department of Jewish Civilization at Georgetown. He is presently assigned as the parochial vicar at the Cathedral of Christ the Light in Oakland, California. And we're very grateful, Dennis, that you came. You schlepped all the way from Oakland to be here with us. He is a professor of theology regularly at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park. Father McManus.
Thank you. Rabbi, thank you for, thank you. Hope you're able to hear me. Is this all right? Everybody can? Great, okay. Rabbi, thank you for your welcome and introduction. As the delegate for Jewish Affairs for the Catholic Church, I'm honored to be invited to participate here in this very timely event to investigate with you the relationship between anti-Semitism and allyship. In my opinion, our gathering could not be more providential or more urgent given the crisis we face in the Middle East. Our efforts here are welcome and much needed over the 6 months, almost to the day, since the horrendous Hamas incursion into Israel. Most of all, I'm grateful to you, Rabbi Visotzky, for the friendship we've enjoyed for so many years of our joint work in Catholic-Jewish dialogue through the National Council of Synagogues and the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. That particular alliance has yielded a rich harvest of exchanges over the last several decades between our communities and has forced us into an honesty with each other which we could never have imagined. And in the present moment, it's these structured dialogues, the National Council of Churches with the bishops, the Modern Orthodox Study Group, again with the Bishops' Conference, and the Orthodox Union and Rabbinic Council of America, again with the Bishops' Dialogue for Orthodox, that are perhaps the backbone of institutional allyship with each other. In many ways, as these dialogues go, so often but not always goes our alliance. As many of you know, the relationship of the Catholic Church to Jewish communities is unique worldwide. Since the parting of the ways, however scholars now date that, between early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, the slow but deadly rise in anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and now anti-Israelism has always carried a distinctive and shamefully Christian branding to it. From the middle of the late patristic period, the process of religious othering of Jews can be traced back to a single and most powerful error on the part of Jesus' followers, an error identified by John Paul II in his October 97 remarks entitled, "The Origin of Anti-Judaism in the Catholic Church." It is namely this, that Christians read their Gospels out of the Jewish contexts in which they are written. To do this is to de-Judaize Jesus, his movement, his followers, his prayer, his people, his teachings, and then, with a seed of future violence planted firmly in its practice, it results in Christians stripping Jews themselves of their own identity in God's plan of salvation for the entirety of the human race. John Paul's insight helps us to see how for centuries Christianity oppositized itself to Judaism. Fed by fanaticism, racism, and a myriad of phobias, it results in the attempted extermination of Jews that we witnessed in the last century. And in this hour, we see its ugly return in our own country in the emergence of a new anti-Semitism that equates Israel with an apartheid state, and further that paints all Jews with a broad brush of bias born of ignorance, unresolved conflict, and racism. What was on the rise in America since Charlottesville and the mass murders at Tree of Life Synagogue has now been refueled by the Nazi-style Hamas attack on Israelis. We must not hide our gaze from the fact that Jew hatred is now portable between cultures, geographies, religions, and races, and that the Holocaust matrix, as it were, can be recalibrated from a Western and Christian crosshairs into a Middle Eastern, radicalized, and terrorist targeting with identical intention. But from when the structure of our dialogue alliance, an old allegation has arisen in these many weeks of crisis. It's no secret that the statements from Catholic conferences of bishops worldwide have been judged inadequate to the moment and to the presumed relationship between the church locally and Jewish communities, especially in their representative rabbinic leadership. That new crisis has been captured in the allegation that the Catholic Church has suddenly abandoned the Jewish people, now under the existential threat of elimination felt in the Hamas incursion. This is the echo of the terrible wound of the Holocaust in Catholic-Jewish relations from 1933 through 1945, the abandonment of Jews by European Catholics to the forces of Nazi and fascist eliminationism that sought to create a Judenfrei globe. To the shame of the Catholic Church, leadership at almost every level in those war years stood by in silence or with ineffective protest. In some quarters, Catholics took heroic action, as both sainthood canonizations and the declarations of righteous among nations teach us. But the toxic seed that John Paul identified as the taproot of anti-Judaism grew over 2 millennia into the twin vines of abandonment and contempt for Jews wrapped in an indifferent silence. Since October 7th, our Jewish dialogue partners have told us loudly and without hesitation that they have again felt the stranglehold of these ancient hatreds in the hesitation, shuffling, and unsureness of Catholic reactions to the Hamas incursion. The ancient and accusing biblical question resounds in Catholic ears. Where are you? First heard in Eden when Adam had betrayed both God and his partner Eve. Catholic response to this Jewish criticism has itself been largely muted and come across as a weak self-accounting. Part of what troubles Catholics in this moment is the horrifying and disabling surprise of the Hamas actions, since nothing like this kind of violence, with its obvious SS-style overlay, has challenged Jewish Catholic alliance since the 1965 promulgation of Nostra Aetate by the Second Vatican Council, repudiating the 4 great ancient Christian tropes about Jews. In effect, Catholics were not ready to respond accordingly, to make necessary distinctions about incursions, law, terrorism, and just war. And in these weeks of hesitation, a terrible and completely unintended message was sometimes given to our Jewish colleagues. Since we are unprepared to defend and ally with you on the terms you need, we seem to have defaulted to abandoning you, as if we had learned nothing since the Holocaust, or Paul VI's great documents, or John Paul's visit to the Western Wall, or Benedict's many interventions to cleanse Catholic thought and expression of anti-Jewish negativity, or Francis's warmth and deep desire for encounter in Israel as a lasting basis for a Catholic Jewish theology of friendship. This is a cause of deepest regret, perhaps best expressed by Pope Francis in his recent letter of February 3rd, addressed to our dialogue partners in Jerusalem. There he affirms the uniqueness of our relationship. He says, quote, "I can only reiterate what my predecessors have also clearly stated many times. The relationship that binds us to you is particular and singular, without ever obscuring naturally the relationship the church has with others. The path the church has walked with you, the ancient people of the covenant, rejects every form of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, unequivocally condemning manifestations of hatred toward Jews and Judaism as a sin against God. Together with you, we Catholics are very concerned about the terrible increase in attacks against Jews around the world." What I hear in the Pope's words is a desire to acknowledge Jewish fears and accusations, reassuring our Jewish brothers and sisters, as he calls his dialogue partners in Israel, that we have learned not only from the past, but from the past redivivus, used most cruelly by Hamas. Catholic readiness, as it were, to engage with Jews must now climb above what it's been accustomed to addressing these past 60 years and be prepared to stand with Jews in every hour of threat and need. At the same time, we must also reflect on how our Jewish colleagues coming from a place of pain can misperceive the church and its intentions, missteps, and complexity as an organization with both local and global leadership structures, which are intricately related. When crisis occurs, both sides must risk communicating face-to-face with trusted colleagues before making judgments. All negative comparisons with the past should be avoided if goodwill is to be maintained. In short, friendship as allyship between individuals in both our dialogues and common projects always serves as the net under the net of safety and perseverance. The tasks ahead for re-strengthening our dialogue alliances are clear. First, renewed energy to understand each other's perspectives. Second, the need to share the monitoring of threats to each community. Third, increased education on the sensitivities of each in dialogue exchanges, building on what we've already achieved. And last, a continual joining of our hearts and minds together in praise of God, who is our life and our salvation. Thank you.
Thank you, Father McManus. Dr. Lisa Jenkins Brown is a cultural strategist, helping organizations increase creativity, productivity, employee retention through presentations addressing diversity and inclusion. She is the author of 3 books, including The Millennial's Guide to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Reverend Lisa received her bachelor's degree from Pace University, an MDiv from New York Theological, and her doctoral degree from McCormick Theological Seminary. She studied organizational leadership at Boston University. She is currently an adjunct assistant professor in multicultural studies at the City University of New York and the senior pastor at a neighboring church. Lisa.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Rabbi Visotzky. I really, truly appreciate this. To our chancellor, thank you for allowing this to convene, and to all of the other panelists. I'm going to attempt to keep the theme in mind, which I was told is allyship is a two-way street for this particular session. So I will also be attempting to touch upon some subjects that have been tossed about. So if you're wondering why I'm talking about these things, that's why I'm talking about these things. As a multicultural professor, I generally begin my classes, and since I am in a seminary, with a working definition. And while you probably have discussed this earlier this morning, I'm going to just look at this whole idea of allyship in its basic sense, referring to a person or group that provides assistance, support in an ongoing effort, activity, or struggle. And for those of us who are gathered here today, I believe our emphasis is on that last word. I would like to emphasize the word struggle, because all of us here are concerned about the struggle, and I'm using capital T, capital S, the struggle. I didn't say struggles, plural. I said the struggle, because sooner or later we're going to realize that there is just no Jewish struggle. There's no black struggle. There's no LGBTQ struggle or indigenous people struggle or struggle for people with physical disabilities or neurological differences. No matter your dimension of diversity, we are all intricately connected because we are all part of the human race. And so for those of us who have belonged to one or more of these groups, we all have varied intersections of our diverse dimensions. But for those of us who belong to specific groups, there are battles that we fight. But there is only one struggle that we must confront. Amen. And that one struggle is the spirit of fear. And right now, if you're not in a battle because you are unaware of the struggle in this world, you are simply at a place of intermission in your own space. Because sooner or later, all of us, no matter our place of origin, no matter our native language, no matter how we worship or who we love, we are all a part of the fellowship of struggle. And so this interreligious dialogue is critical, I believe, because we are at a critical place in history as a collective, not just as a Jewish people, not just as black people. I don't want to spend too much time on whether or not this dialogue is advantageous or not. That was one of the questions that had been asked of me. Is it an advantageous dialogue? And I want to say that the very fact that we are here proves that this is an advantageous dialogue that needs to take place. Everyone in this room is gathered here because we realize that connecting and communicating is the only way to expose the cracks and the crevices that have been hidden so long in the struggle, while realizing that the solution may be different for some. What do I mean? I mean, if I have a headache, the solution is to take a painkiller. Some people, however, cannot take aspirin. Some people have to take Tylenol. Others might have to take ibuprofen. There must, however, be a remedy, but I'm not going to give my brother or sister aspirin if there is a sensitivity for some reason. So this dialogue is good, although we may not always agree. And for some, there might be some little bit of internal pushback because of some sort of allergic reaction that we might have. But to address the question which had been asked, of me, what does my community expect from the Jewish community when it comes to allyship, which is why I'm going to talk about this. What does my community expect from the Jewish community in terms of allyship? I'm going to start by telling you what we don't need. What we don't need is another march or rally. We don't need another march or rally. I first met my girl, Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay, and Rabbi Jan Urbach, I don't know if she's here somewhere, back in 2017 when members of Jewish Theological Seminary decided to march for justice and religious tolerance. And they will both tell you that I was not in the mood to march. When I received the call from them, I said to myself, who are these women? And where did they come from? And where have they been all of my life? I have been marching for over half a century. Since I was a small girl, I marched with my church family at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Flushing, Queens, under the leadership of the late Dr. Timothy P. Mitchell, whose father was pastor and who hosted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his family when they would come to New York to visit. I lived and grew up in East Elmhurst, Queens, exactly 2 blocks away from where Malcolm X's house was bombed. And so we held a Zoom meeting, the 3 of us, and they said, we're from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and we're stunned at what's happening in our country, and we want to do something about it. And I confess, and they know this story, I rolled my eyes. I rolled my eyes, and I continued to ask myself, who are these women, and where have they been all of my life? But the Spirit moved. I sensed their pain, and I sensed their confusion at what was happening in our country and in our world. And like many women, particularly women of color, I put aside my own fatigue that I had from years of marching against the storms and the tide. And I found my very worn and old marching shoes. I pulled them out and I marched with Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay and Rabbi Jan Urbach, along with my church, which I brought with me. And we have been besties ever since. We don't speak every day, but I believe these women who exist and serve in one of the most misogynistic sectors in society, the religious society, the 3 of us have been woven together in a constant and unique place, which gives us a consistent and unique perspective of the struggle. And so a question was asked, what does my community expect in return? My community and those who exist within the African American religious community, we don't need another march. As I said, we don't need or expect handouts. We don't need or expect anything of that nature. The African American religious community, like most religious communities, has had a downward trend in membership and finances in this country. Religion in general is on a downward swing in this country. People are embracing spirituality, but are rejecting religion, whether it's Christianity or whether it's Judaism. Islam, they're rejecting it. The downward trajectory was visible prior to the pandemic, has accelerated during the pandemic and post-pandemic. While we see this in houses of worship across religions and worldviews for various societal and historical reasons that time won't permit, the Black church has been hit hard by finances, while other ministries have been able to navigate rivers of fiscal sustainability, adapting and pivoting while continuing to impact their communities. And again, I'm going into this because it was asked, what do we seek? We do not seek pity, we seek partners. Partners that would enable us to collaborate on not just projects, but to navigate these fiscal challenges. And so the American religious scene is a unique one, where our Constitution encourages freedom, worship as we choose. However, the American culture overall is one that encourages a conservative, Protestant, Christian worldview from a white Western perspective that has proven to wield the Christian Bible as a tool of oppression. Historically, both Jews and African Americans have labored side by side in the struggle against an oppressive Christian worldview shaped by Western hegemonic ideology. So many in the African American community view the heinous and horrific October 7th kidnapping of 253 hostages Hamas as an opportunity. And this is many of our views and understandings. We see this as an opportunity for Benjamin Netanyahu to rain terror on innocent lives in the Gaza. The African American community recognizes the pain inflicted upon the Jewish people by Hamas. Many of you, or some of you, I don't know, might have relatives who are there still being held hostages. The brutalities and the atrocities suffered is unimaginable. And while we feel your very real pain, we ache for your agony. We have been under consistent aggressions in our own communities, our homes, and what is still the yet to be United States of America. Over 400 years. Generational trauma, which books like The Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome and books like The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk help to understand the nature of trauma as an intergenerational impact. Intergenerational trauma impacts our homes where families deal with mental health issues with little to no health coverage, affects our communities with food deserts void of healthy options, affects how we respond to the persistent racism and systemic and overt and covert racism. Intergenerational trauma manifests itself mentally and physically, and we are triggered from everything from a massive American flag that I witness every time I drive down I-95 to the south of the border, to when I walk on Jefferson Highway, which is named after the President of the Confederacy. We are triggered when we hear another black male is released from jail and proven innocent only because of a nonprofit organization that was enabling him to be released. And so time will not permit me to get into all of this capitalistic nature and the industries and the racism. It will not permit me to get into the other aspects of what we deal with as a people collectively and individually. But we must understand that there is the struggle. Imagine what has been unfilmed. Imagine what we do not see. And so, yes, we weep with our brothers and sisters who are Jewish. We weep with those who suffer on October 7th, but however hard we weep, we have few tears to show because we have been weeping and we have dried our tears for so long. What we see through the glazed eyes with the fog are more people of color who are being exterminated in Gaza. We see indigenous people and look back to what has been happening in this land for over 400 years. We see and experience the reverberating effects of slavery, Jim Crow, and we see people screaming for a second time around, make America great again. We see women's rights being taken from us. And so we're here together at this intersection of pain and despair, attempting to reroute our journey. But the question is, are we passive allies? I say we should not be. I say we should be advocates for one another. And we should not seek one another when there's a time of battles, but we should be consistent allies and advocates during the entire struggle so that we can be stronger with one another in times like October and in times that are to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Lisa. Dr. Hussein Rashid is the Assistant Dean for Religion and Public Life and a lecturer on religion and public life at the Harvard Divinity School. For those of you that don't know, Harvard is a small school just outside of Boston. He works with a variety of NGOs, foundations, nonprofits, and governmental agencies for content expertise on religion broadly and with a specialization on Islam. Hussein has a BA in Middle Eastern Studies from our neighboring Columbia University, a Master of Theological Studies from the Harvard Divinity School, and an MA and PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. Dr. Rashid.
Bismillah. I want to begin by thanking Burt. It feels weird calling you Rabbi Visotzky, so it's going to be Burt. I want to thank Burt for inviting me to this panel, JTS for hosting, all the lovely people who put this conference together, my fellow panelists, you, the audience, for being here. And I have to add Vice Chancellor Joel, who introduced me to the Kabbalah exhibition at the library this morning, which was a great way to spend that morning. Thank you. There you are, yes. So thank you for that. I also need to begin with an apology, not for anything I have to say, but for what I will have to do, which is I will have to run shortly after the break for the eclipse because I need to be back in Boston by tomorrow morning, catching the last train back. So I do apologize for that, but I'm always happy to chit-chat for those who reach out. My comments are in response to prompts we all received from Burt, and trying to structure them in a sort of narrative that made sense, I think, for the two-way street of what we need in allyship. And so I want to begin by talking about how the fight against anti-Semitism has to be seen as a shared struggle. It is a particular manifestation of white supremacy under which many of us suffer. It is Europe's first racism, and it is embedded in the psyche of the US as deeply as anti-Black racism. We cannot understand individual community marginalization without understanding the inherited structures from these forms of racism. In other words, if we want to understand how we are at the state we are in today in the United States, where Charlottesville happens, where the shooting at the Tree of Life happens, where we have MAGA for the second time happening, we have to understand the history. And I thought this morning's panel was great. I think it was Dr. Corbett who kept saying, we look at history to understand the present, right? And how do we get there? And if we look at anti-Semitism as the first racism that shapes our nation and intertwined with anti-Black racism, it explains so much of our social structures coming in from Europe and happening in the United States. And so for me, this shared struggle is not a metaphorical or rhetorical way of thinking about this, but is historical and practical. That this is a shared struggle that requires us to be working together. One simply has to look at the images we saw most recently from Dr. Kramer not 30 minutes ago on the screen up here or in the presentation room across the atrium. To look at the images and say, yes, these are stereotypical Jewish images, and then pick up almost any political cartoon today in the year 2024 and see how Arabs and Muslims are represented and see it is simply the transposition of those images from one religious minority group onto another religious minority group. It is about the hook nose. It is about the corpulent body. It is about the inappropriate access and control of wealth. It is about sexual anxieties of racial purity and the demon of miscegenation that comes through. And so we have to understand how that permeates our society, how that visual vocabulary persists and sits with us. For me, when we start talking then, how do we start building community engagement? How do we start building connections? Is we have to start with the question of, do these engagements hide other agendas? I've been doing this work, I joke in a different bio than Burt read out, but I've been doing interfaith work when it was just called hanging out with your friends. I grew up in Queens, New York, in Rego Park. So you know the world I'm talking about, right? These were our people. It was like, it wasn't about religion. It was like, who had the best food Friday, right? And so that idea of thinking about formal interfaith then brings the questions of what are the institutional questions we need to be asking? When are we not, or when are we talking about Israel-Palestine, whether we realize it or not? What agendas are being hidden in these conversations? Is it about money? Is it about power? Is it about access? Is it about distraction? And this is part of the trust-building process, and it's the need for transparency and reputation building. When we see new interfaith organizations popping up one night after a crisis, everybody's suspicious. And if you're not, you should be. Because this is not work that happens overnight. This is work that happens over time, that happens between individuals and then to institutions. I think there also has to be a recognition, and I'll speak very specifically of Muslim-Jewish dialogue, that we are not working with the Jewish community and we are not working with the Muslim community. We are working with a Jewish community, we are working with a Muslim community. And each of these communities has their own needs and interests in a given moment. And those needs and interests are going to shift organically over time. And if we're doing our job right, and if we're doing it together, they should be moving in alignment. And if we drift apart, that's okay, because that's part of the process as well. And if we come together in a more intimate relationship, that's okay too, because that's part of the work. I'm going to turn to my relationship with Burt, who's my rabbi in the New York sense of the word, right? He's been a friend, a mentor, a colleague, a compatriot, and the way we've interacted, what we've done, what we do, what we've committed to each other has changed over time. When we first started engaging, this is 2024, so what, 15 years ago? Give or take, probably early, a little bit longer. Very different than I think the work we're doing together now. But we are engaged in a values-based commitment to particular types of interreligious discourse. And it's different than the relationship I have with somebody, an alum of JTS, Jill Jacobs over at Trua, who I went to college with. It's very different than the relationship I have with my students right now at Harvard Divinity School, who are part of JVP, who feel deeply isolated from organized Jewish life at Harvard, because they do not, Jewish Voices for Peace, for those who are not, I think, acronym soup, but who are parts of Jewish Voices for Peace, who do not feel part of organized Jewish life because they feel their Judaism is not recognized in that space. These are relationships that are transitory, that sometimes will build into greater things, that will sometimes intersect after 10 years. But that's the reality, is that where we are and how we interact are based on our realities at any given moment. But I think of all of these as relationships, because that's what they should become, that's what they should be. In other words, they're not transactional, but they're deeply relational. They're deeply about our connections as individuals. And I think it's what is important and what is part of what it means to participate in an intentional way in a multi-religious scene in the United States. We can't stay at the surface level of breaking bread, but my richest relationships have moved from breaking bread to breaking open those questions that often divide us. As a result, when Israel and Palestine become part of the conversation, no one should be surprised as to where I stand. I believe firmly and unequivocally that Palestinians are human beings. They are entitled to all the rights we believe human beings deserve. I also believe that they are currently in occupied territories being denied the right to self-determination. As a result, I have a commitment to BDS. When moments like this happen and these hard conversations emerge, when they have to happen in ways nobody's expecting, it is no shock where I'm coming from because my commitment is to human dignity. My support of Palestinian lives is not predicated on a dismissal of Israeli lives. I am as horrified by the loss of life on October 7th as I am at the loss of life after that. I am committed to a just peace that results in an equitable resolution for all parties in this conflict. And after October 7th, I mourned with my friends who suffered and whose families suffered and continue to suffer. And I also recognize that the result would be a massive loss of Palestinian life. Under the Netanyahu government, the average retaliation rate has been 50 Palestinians for every one Israeli killed. This has been true for about 20 years of Netanyahu's reign. We are approaching about a 40-to-1 ratio at the 6-month mark of the bombing campaign. The office I work with at Harvard, recognizing what would happen after October 7th, released a statement putting the conflict in a historical conflict, not to lay blame on Israel, but to try to diffuse a narrative that we knew would emerge of barbaric Palestinians, to avoid a situation where we have narratives that dehumanize and permit murder under the guise of retribution and justice. Narratives that were used in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and Iraq again. Narratives grounded, ironically, in anti-Semitic tropes moved on to new subjects. We received a significant amount of support from across religious and political communities, and condemnation from across religious and political communities. And personally, even though people who disagreed with me wrote to say to me that they needed time to talk to me, not one of my friends who I considered relational allies in this work broke off relationships. And I think that's because we've built real bonds based on transparency, not on feints and kumbaya. I also think it's because we are not allies. We are accomplices. Allies are based on positions of power. But what power do marginalized communities have to protect each other? I can't perhaps use the fact that I am a straight male to be an ally to queer and/or women-presenting folk, because I do have a certain type of power in that space. But Jewish and Muslim communities are both marginalized and white nationalist narratives. We cannot be allies to each other. We must be accomplices with one another. We must act together to change systems of oppression that we are shared against us. We have to recognize when we are accepting of narratives of power that benefit us in the short term, but are a trap to hurt us in the long term, and that ultimately divide us. Israel and Palestine will continue to complicate narratives, but it cannot distract us from being accomplices. If we are truly values aligned, even when we differ on Israel and Palestine, we can move to a deeper understanding. By saying this, I'm not advocating to ignore the issue or pretend we get along on it, but to accept that we have differing narratives on what justice looks like. The call, then, is trying to figure out if we can work towards a common sense of justice and thus a just peace. And if the answer to that is no, then Israel-Palestine is not a complication, it is a clarification. And even if we cannot agree that Palestinians are people, it does not mean I will deny your humanity or allow anti-Semitism to fester. And I've got my 30 seconds over limit, so I'll just finish with this. And so this is the lesson I want to return to. Anti-Semitism is definitionally, categorically wrong. And it is integrated into anti-Black racism and Islamophobia in this country. Any expression of one guarantees the expression of the others. They are intimately linked. It is those commitments and relationships that have stood through this crisis that I'm grateful for. They're the ones who have stood with me against charges of presumptive anti-Semitism because I am Muslim and or pro-Palestinian humanity. And although even though as they stand with me, they may be calling me an idiot and a fool in other aspects of this issue, because that's what accomplices do. It is support and accountability. The weaponization of anti-Semitism weakens the real work against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, against anti-Black racism. It allows the white nationalist agenda to define and divide us. It is incumbent for us to recognize our individual community's form of marginalization and to recognize it is part of larger systems that force us to come together in order to survive. And the only thing that we need to work towards now is the creation of a just, durable peace. That work does not end. And I'm going to paraphrase a gift I received from Burt about 15 years ago. It is not on us to finish the work, but nor can we ignore it. I pray for the strength to do that work and to have accomplices in it. Thank you.
Thank you, my brother. Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay is Associate Dean of the Rabbinical School and Executive Director of the JTS Handel Center for Ethics and Justice. She's made her career in the Jewish social justice sector, having served in leadership positions at the American Jewish World Service, Auburn Theological Seminary, Avodah the Jewish Service Corps, Joint for Justice. Rabbi Ruskay is an alumna of the JTS Joint Program, the Davidson School, and the Rabbinical School. That's almost a perfect suite.
I'm done.
She directs field education and entrepreneurial endeavors and is focused on raising the scope and profile of social justice work and community organizing skills in the role of the contemporary rabbi. Rabbi Ruskay is a member of the Social Justice Commission of our Rabbinical Assembly and of its Joint Placement Commission. Stephanie.
Thank you. My children are off from school on Wednesday. It's Eid al-Fitr, the break fast for the month of daytime fasting for Ramadan. There's a mother in the school parents WhatsApp group that never fails to write, are the kids really off on X day? For a holiday that she is not familiar with. They are also off for Eid al-Adha, Juneteenth, Easter observed, and Passover. I think human brains are wired to be concerned and suspicious about things, people, and practices that are not familiar to us. The mom from the WhatsApp group is likely suspicious specifically because she's not in relationship with any Muslims. She would probably do well to find a practicing Muslim friend and ask them how they observe the holidays and what they mean to them, rather than to continue to question why her kids are off from school. Multi-faith and interreligious dialogue only helps if we choose to put ourselves in relationships with people of different faith traditions than our own. One recent example of that working well is a List College student from our undergraduate program who recently told me that she was studying in the library and a non-Jewish friend or acquaintance sat down next to her and asked, "Would you please tell me, what does it mean to you to be a Jewish person who lives here and feels connected to Israel as a homeland?" This is small-scale interreligious dialogue, and it makes a difference in how we see each other. I'm a rabbi and an engaged Jew, and I'm a community organizer. Organizing informs how I think about relationships. Here are a few organizing principles that I think help multi-faith work and interreligious dialogue go better. Know your self-interest. Why do you want to be in relationship with the other party? Of course, you might like them and become friends, but likely you have another reason for being able to articulate it helps you stay clear on what the relationship is and its purpose. Be curious and even ask the other person's self-interest. If you're able to speak openly about each of your self-interests, then either of you can say, if you have drifted into territory, that isn't why you are nurturing this relationship. It's okay to have relationships that are for the purposes of being community bridge builders. To keep it interesting, I'm going to invite you to think for a moment about your own self-interest in doing interfaith dialogue work. Why do you do it? Are we allowed to ask anybody?
I think
Just
Tucker-
raise your hand. I know we don't have any
Tucker's standing
microphone.
already.
Do you want to say? Anybody in here, why do you do interfaith dialogue work? I'm just going to take 2 answers, so don't make me wait forever. Yeah. We can learn a lot. All right, now you're next.
Can you repeat that so we
Yes,
can hear?
so people of faith find each other and find something to connect over. Thank you. It's finding company. So here are my reasons. I always find my own faith enriched when I come in close contact with people from other faith traditions. It makes me look at my own tradition with fresh eyes and renewed appreciation. Also, occasionally, I find another tradition that I appreciate and look for ways to learn from, even if I'm not appropriating it. One example of this is the Baha'i tradition, that once an idea is shared, it becomes communal property. The idea is not repeated in the name of the person who devised it. I always appreciated this as a contrast to the Jewish communities, ensuring to always credit the person who taught you something. I see the benefits of both ways of operating, and interreligious dialogue helped me expand my ideas about humility and honor. Religion is a force that brings a lot of nourishment and comfort to lots of people. It's also wielded as a weapon and source of much conflict in the world. A reason to have dialogue is to increase the numbers of people who understand each other and might be peacemakers when conflicts arrive. Even though the number of people in this country who consider themselves religious or religiously involved is smaller than it once was, it is still a way to organize and group people. So if you want to make change in the world, one way to do it is to enlist people who have something in common, for instance, their religious community. Here are a few other organizing principles that inform my approach to interreligious dialogue. No permanent friends and no permanent enemies. We probably won't agree on everything. Sometimes we will hope for different outcomes in policy or an election. Sometimes, as in this moment with the war in Israel and Gaza, people feel that whoever sees things differently from them is an enemy who must not care about human rights. No permanent friends and no permanent enemies reminds us that the war is over. When the war is over, however it ends, we will have to find our way back to each other, and we'll have to find ways to relate to each other. We should not lose other fights for justice because we didn't agree on this one. I have been part of a small team of rabbis convening conversations with other rabbis who are feeling conflicted in their own interracial and interreligious work because of the ongoing war in Israel and Gaza. Some of them took bigger actions addressing racial justice after George Floyd was murdered than they had ever taken before. They put up Black Lives Matter signs on their synagogues. They met privately and publicly with African American church leaders, and they came out to protest. Now, with the war in Israel and Gaza, some are sad and mad that these African American church leaders are not reaching out to them. Some feel lonely and betrayed. Others wonder why, after all the Jewish community did and all that they did, are they not reaching out and understanding the justification for this war? We, the rabbis convening the group, are offering a space for sharing their feelings, giving a voice to their disappointment. We are encouraging them to think really deeply before they escalate. Escalating might mean taking down a Black Lives Matter sign or formally cutting off ties. One of the challenges to their acting out their disappointment is that Jews of color would feel cut in half and invisible. They would be alienated and likely not return. We would undo every ounce of racial justice work we've done in the last decade. We would also erode the confidence of the African American church leaders with whom they worked, and it would be difficult to restart in the future. Which leads me to the next framework that I find useful. Coalition spaces are not home spaces. When we enter into coalition, we should all be a little uncomfortable because lots of people with different traditions, values, and priorities are sharing space. None of us should feel totally comfortable. If we are looking to coalition spaces to make us feel totally at home, then we are misusing them. Reminding ourselves that they are important, even though they are uncomfortable, might help us stay there more effectively. When I am in this work, I try to ask myself, who am I centering? Is it me, or is this about a greater good? And relatedly, the last frame I find useful in my work is we should be careful not to compare our best acts to someone else's worst acts. If we reached out after a shooting to another community, we should remember that there may likely have been lots of other times that we did not show up. We should resist the urge to glorify our own actions while magnifying other people's shortcomings. We are all the heroes of our own stories, and it's worth trying to see the story from the other community's perspective. My grandmother used to end phone calls by asking, is there anything I should have asked that I didn't ask? Perhaps we could use her model for interreligious relationships. Are there any more ways to be connected or to have shown up for you that I did not? Might be a bridge-building way to approach multi-faith relationships. Also, we need to remember that being connected and interconnected doesn't mean we will not disappoint each other. There are lots of reasons an ally might not do what you want. We would all do better to focus on being connected and being ready to deal with the eventual disappointment. It feels a little bit like child rearing. You tell your kids no all the time. At least I do. It doesn't mean you don't love them or that the relationship is over. It means on that issue at that moment, you won't agree. But hopefully, there is a mutual love and understanding undergirding the no that prevents it from being relationship ending. One challenge to multi-faith work is that we haven't usually invested enough in the long-term trust building that would prevent the no from being devastating. I want to share one more story. Along with Dr. Shira Billet, who leads our Hendel Center for Ethics and Justice with me, I recently met with some List College students. We have been creating opportunities for students with diverse opinions on the war to come together to share how they are feeling and what they are experiencing. One thing they said has really troubled me. They talked about anti-normalization campaigns taking place on various campuses around the country. This is where students take a stand by choosing to end contact and friendships with Jewish students because they are connected to Israel. We know that isolation is traumatizing. Bullying is traumatizing. Lots of young adults have stories of the time their friends in middle school stopped talking to them, usually for arbitrary reasons. This is a political choice not to speak to people because they are Jewish and are in some way connected to Israel. This is a time for adults to get involved. It's a time for interreligious dialogue. This is a moment for religious leaders to be clear with young people in their communities that ignoring people and disconnecting from them because you don't support a cause they believe in or an aspect of their religious identity is not an ethical or religious stance. One way or another, this war will end. By not intervening in social ostracization on college campuses, we run the risk of witnessing and helping create an even more toxic atmosphere that will make recovery even more difficult. College students are forming habits now and lenses for seeing the world that will follow them into adulthood. People who believe multi-faith and interreligious work has value should be intervening in the anti-normalization campaigns. Students may feel like an anti-normalization campaign is the least a person can do to act on their values, but in fact, they are harming society and the ripples will be felt for years to come. In our Beit Midrash, we have the famous Talmudic teaching, which is better, study or action. The answer is study that leads to action. I'd say the same for interreligious dialogue. Dialogue is good, but it's insufficient if it doesn't lead to action by the many and not just the elite. Reverend Jenkins Brown and I got together to reconnect this past week, and we agreed we aren't interested in talking just for the sake of talking. The interreligious work we are interested in is work that gets people out in the world doing things together. It is work that brings people out to vote for policies that benefit everybody. It's working together to ensure that underserved communities get more access to the very resources that would make healthcare, jobs, clean energy, and education human rights that everyone can count on. We are interested in talking that leads to action.
Thank you, Rabbi Ruskay. We're going to talk amongst ourselves for a few minutes, and then we will open the floor to the audience. But anyone who has questions, please get our cards and pass them to either end. Little guys here will be on the other aisle. Select them, and I'll be on this aisle. Thank you. A number of years ago, we were privileged to have the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Lema Bowie from Liberia, to come here to JTS to speak to us. And Lema also talked about the importance of dialogue and relationship. And I proudly, of course, pointed out that JTS has been doing interfaith dialogue since 1938, when my teacher Louis Finkelstein got together with Margaret Mead and Reinhold Niebuhr and founded the Institute for Religious and Social Studies. And Lema looked me in the eye and she said, "You know, Rabbi," the term rabbi was not actually meant to be a term of honor. She said, "It's all nice that you have dialogue, but for what?" And that what has haunted me. What is it that we need to do? Stephanie, I think, very beautifully underscored that the dialogue that she and Lisa have, or any of us have, and this is going to be my question to my colleagues, the dialogue should produce something. I happen to disagree with you. I think friendship is a very good thing, and I don't necessarily distinguish between friendship space and collegial space. I like to make friends among my colleagues, and that's very important to me. And that's part of my self-interest. And I just want to finish my remarks with a comment. One of the reasons I asked all of my colleagues to talk about the problem of Gaza, of the Israel-Palestine relationship, is my self-interest. I have a young cousin, Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who got his arm blown off on October 7th. We don't really know if he's still alive, but if he is, he's a hostage. And so I have a very strong vested interest in bringing the hostages home, and that colors everything. And every single day since October 7th, I have reached out to my interfaith colleagues because it should be obvious to the powers that be that the Jews have an interest, and it should also be obvious that Hamas isn't really all that interested in what the Jews have to say. But maybe the Pope, maybe this one, maybe that one. So I am constantly doing this kind of outreach on behalf of my young cousin Hirsch and the other hostages. And it's a painful reality that we live. God willing, the hostage crisis will end, and people will come home and they'll be safe. They'll never be the same again, but at least they'll be safe. But then there'll be the next issue and the next issue. I think that all of you have begun to raise issues that we need to work on together. But I'd kind of like to go, I'll start with my friend Dennis here. What are the issues you think we really need to tackle that we best tackle together?
Are you talking about just Catholic-Jewish relations? Or
Principally? Whatever you want, Father McManus.
I'd rather not be first. Okay. Think about this. Well, the four things I mentioned at the end of my own talk are four things that I think we've deferred. They're sort of deferred maintenance in dialogue. The most important one is this. When a crisis arises, when there's a problem, that individuals in the dialogue, because of their personal relationships, have to pick up the phone and talk. There's no substitute for personal relationality in this business. Even on the institutional level, where you have very fine structures and wonderful places and people and publishing things. That's all fine. But it's heart to heart, mind to mind, hand to hand that matters. And in the end, that's all that matters, and it's all that will make something matter. I'll give an example. A dozen years ago more, Rabbi Michael Shudrik, who's chief rabbi of Poland,
A classmate of mine from JTS.
right, he was faced with a terrible piece of Polish, bigoted, anti-Jewish legislation. It was to outlaw all kosher production of meat in Poland. No, you may not prepare meat in any way as a rabbi would. You have to abide by these new Dutch and other European Union ways, and kosher preparation of meat will be forbidden, and we're all going to vote for that in the Polish parliament, and et cetera. He called Rabbi Eric Greenberg at the ADL at that point. And Rabbi Eric called me because I was Cardinal Dolan's secretary. And he said, we need help with this. And I said, how do we help you? So give me the background, the position paper, which I then wrote up and gave to the Cardinal. He said, I'm going out the door, Father Dennis, to be at World Youth Day. I'll read it on the plane. Call me when I get there. So I called him. He was on the podium standing next to the Pope. He's got his cell phone out. So Cardinal Dolan, so American, right? And I said, Eminence, they need help here. This is an anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish kind of trope. The Nazis started this as their first foothold into Polish society back in the 30s. We have to stop it. He goes, I know what to do. Can you hold a minute? The kids are singing. It was, World Youth Day, okay, and everybody's got a happy dance on. He walks across the stage to see the Cardinal Secretary of State, Sedano. E mi scusi, Eminenza, che cosa che facciamo? Can you call the nuncio in Poland and tell him that this is absolutely un-Catholic to do? And Sedano says, I will not only do that, I'll instruct him to begin visiting every Catholic member of Parliament and opening the question this way. Do you really think we're going to stand by and watch this happen again? Every one of them got that visit, a little knock at the door. Then he said, I'll call my friend, the nuncio to the UN, and we'll raise the objection there. Would that help? Well, yeah, that would help. Yeah. So we hung up, and Rabbi and I spoke, and then Rabbi Shudrik spoke, and sure enough, the walnuts are moving on the table in the Polish parliament, and before you know it, this thing is off the table. That's what dialogue is for.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, I don't know why we dialogue.
I thank you for that. And I want to say, because I really think it should be acknowledged publicly, I count Timothy Dolan, my Cardinal Archbishop, as a friend. And now on 4 separate occasions, be it email, a phone call, a letter, Tim Dolan has reached out with a very simple question to me. Burt, how's Hirsch? Any news on Hirsch? I'm going to be in Rome. I'll talk to the Holy Father to see what we can do for Hirsch. And indeed, Dennis, your example is really good because it makes a personal difference to have these cross-religious relations. Lisa, you want to jump in?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Well, I mean, you spoke to it in some measure already, so I'm inviting you to expand on it, which is, what are the things we can do through our dialogue that really would make a difference?
Okay, so in my work as a cultural strategist working with organizations and as a professor of multicultural studies, I have begun to use what's called the faith factor. And I generally use it in secular organizations, but I think that in this instance, the faith factor is even more important. And it's really the F, which is for knowledge. We know that there is going to be a struggle. We know that there is a struggle. And because we know it and we know that there are going to be other battles, we know that we must always be ready. We have to fortify ourselves with the foreknowledge and understanding that we must come together and be ready because there are already forces that are working to divide us. and that if we are stronger, or if we are together, we are stronger together. Then there's the A. We talked about allyship, but I like to use the word advocacy, because as I mentioned before, an advocate is one that works. An advocate is a person that is active. An advocate is not just being passive with words, but an advocate is coming together in that partnership so that we can work together against those forces that have already been formed to come against us. And I say us. Then there's the I, which is integrity. I don't want to go into that, but it takes integrity to stand and to be able to speak and to do so unashamedly, to do so with courage, to do so not just for oneself, but to do so for one's sister and brothers. It takes integrity.
So, Lisa, I want you to name an issue. What can we do together now, in the next year? What should we be joining forces to do to
So
solve?
you don't want me to talk about the T and the H, which is trust and habits. Okay, so anyway, what should we do now? Well, then I'm going to say that we should first of all trust one another, because I don't think there's trust involved in our community. So I will get to my T, which is trust. Because I do think that because of what we often are dealing with in our own communities, we do either forget about what's happening in other communities, or we are so drained that it is difficult to bear the burdens of our brothers and our sisters. And the H is habits, so that how are we going to be intentional? You said, what can we do? How can we be intentional? So we're talking about anti-Semitism here, obviously. Myself, I was dealing with a whole lot of things when October 7th came around. I'm talking about a host of things that are happening in my community and in my own household. We're talking mental health issues in my own family. We're talking about financial issues in my church, operating with deficits, a whole lot of different things. But then I had to really think, and I had to really be intentional. That's what a habit is. A habit is when you are doing something intentionally, when you begin to do something intentionally over and over. I had to be intentional about reaching out to you. I had to be intentional about reaching out to Stephanie. I had to be intentional about it, even though I had been going through my own trauma that is collective. Mm-hmm. And we're not measuring our trauma, okay? That's not what today is about. But it's a very real situation. So to be habitual about making sure that we reach out to one another, to be intentional about recognizing that when people in Israel are being kidnapped, I still must speak out, even though there are individuals here in America who are part of the industrial prison complex simply because they have a mental health issue and are not able to afford a lawyer like other people who are able to afford health care and psychologists and are able to afford lawyers. I must be intentional about those things.
So what I'm hearing you saying, and it's very welcome, is that we can't really be one-issue people. We have to look at our own issues, and then we have to look at the issues of our neighbors and take on the burden of both.
We have to walk and chew gum at the same time. I know that's
Here,
difficult.
Okay. Dr. Rashid, what do you put to the list?
I think if you're asking for the next year, I think the thing that has become so apparent to me over the last several months is the brittleness and falseness of our interfaith relations to date. And I think we need to, the commitment for the next year should be rethinking those. And as somebody who's involved in higher education and seeing what's happening both at Columbia and at Harvard, how do we model alternatives for them to understand that we don't have to agree to not be cruel? You know, and I think that would be the two prongs I would take, is how do we, for the generations below, how do we model a way of being that is hopeful and allows space for disagreement and deep disagreements, and also deep connection? And how do we reimagine what we're doing in interfaith so that it is leading to action that is not brittle and is not just for the good times?
I appreciate that. I mean, I'm especially appreciative that you are involved with campuses that have been maligned for their lack of attention. And so the fact that you're there modeling is reassuring to us. I want to recognize Eric Greenberg, who just walked in. You were out of the room when Dennis McManus waved the flag for you, so I do want to thank you for being here, Eric, and recognize that Dennis sang your praises for getting things done. And that's what I'm talking about now with the panel, which is what do we need to get done in interfaith circles? And Rabbi Ruskay, you get the last shot as an organizer. What would you organize us to do?
Well, we only have one planet that we all share, so I think addressing it and making it livable is probably important. And the other thing is, I think faith community is advocating for a year of service where people sort of get to know each other and do some service for the country, taking into account class and that it's easier for some people to volunteer than others. But I think we don't have an obligation to serve in this country, which doesn't, it's not great for the country, and it is a place where people could meet each other who would not usually encounter each other.
So
for
Stephanie,
domestic service.
if I'm hearing you about what you're saying about year of service, you're not talking about, although you maybe included, kids like when they graduate college to take a gap year. You're talking about all of us at any age taking a year and really serving. Is that correct?
I am. I think that there are some natural points at which it would be easier. I think just after high school is one natural time. We also see lots of seniors who are deciding, I mean, senior citizens, people who have completed their careers. Not, well, you know, I still work with you, so. But people who are at a moment in life where they have more time, and they can use it in lots of ways, but we don't encourage people doing that with people they don't know who are different from them. And this is going to be a tough political year.
No, but it's a wonderful and extraordinary suggestion. Rabbi Tucker, can I invite you to use that microphone and lob some questions at us?
Yes.
Gordon represents all of you, the questions you.
I can't represent all of you because we don't really have time to cover all of these questions, but I've tried to cluster them a little bit. So here are two questions that really come together in a kind of a pragmatic way, which I think is important for all of us. One says, the interreligious relationships that we are talking about here seem to be characterizable as grass tops. Relationship with other faith leaders who share some common missions in the world. How do our communities cultivate grassroots relationships to build trust and to learn each other's stories? And pairing that with a question of what resources are there to volunteer in New York City communities, schools, universities, to help people of other races and religions to know us, to help them, to tutoring, whatever it might be.
I mean, it's intriguing to me how much that first half of the question anticipated what Lisa had to say about building trust and what Dennis had to say about you can't wait for the emergency to call somebody. You need to have a relationship and a long-standing relationship. I just want to give one quick example related to my cousin Hirsch because it's so central to me. My interfaith colleagues have been reaching out nonstop for the last 6 months, just checking in. How's Hirsch, any news, anything? And that I appreciate it should go without saying, but I will say it, I appreciate it endlessly. But I think more than anything, what I appreciated was getting a note like that from one of my Palestinian colleagues. There's no question in my mind that he is pro-Palestine, he wants to end the war in Gaza, that he thinks what Israel is doing is terrible, but he had enough humanity to realize his friend, I was hurting, and he reached out to me, and that's huge. But I want to put Stephanie back on the spot because you have done so much good organizing work over so many years. What are the kind of ways we can sign up? Did I get that second half right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was not an easy question. Look, I think nobody can wait for somebody to invite you. Like, you have to just decide to do it. There's not like some big organizing structure in this country that's gonna invite you. Mm-hmm. This is the perfect opportunity. Like, everyone just has to lead. You have to decide that it's in your self-interest to make this country better, to have relationships. So think about who you know. And if you only know people who are mainly like you, then I encourage you to figure out how you can meet some other people. And I mean, one thing that we're doing right now is the Hendel Center is doing a project where we're training adults in organizing in Ohio. And we decided to focus on one state, and we're giving people skills to do one-to-one relational meetings, house meetings, and they're going to be focusing on a campaign around gerrymandering and redistricting in Ohio. Excellent. And everybody sort of is getting tools for how do you engage other people, how do you talk about what matters to you. And then how do you act? And we're measuring our success on if people actually act, not if they just meet people. So I think it's deciding that you want to be a person who's in relationship with other people and constantly, sort of step by step, setting out opportunities. And then you'll see who else is there, who also seems like they want to be doing things with other people.
I'm going to throw one in the hopper as well, and full disclosure, I'm on the board. But I'm on the board of Union Theological Seminaries, that's right across the street. Union has a Center for Earth Ethics that's very, very focused on environmental repair. As Stephanie said, we only got one planet, so we have to work to save it. And the director, Corinna Gore, would happily welcome anyone who wants to volunteer. Any you want to add?
Sure, thank you for that. I would like to say that if anyone wants to volunteer on a local level with, for instance, a small organization that does big things, call 212-281-5433. That's 212-281-5433. We are a church here in the area. We've worked with Dr. Visotzky as well during the pandemic.
This is St. Matthew's.
St. Matthew's Baptist Church, and we have done a lot of interreligious work with the Jewish community. And I will say publicly, we have a very small budget, and we have a very small budget, and we are operating at a deficit. I'll just say it, $210,000 is our budget. Yeah. $210,000 is our operating budget, and we're at a deficit. But we continue to feed people in the community. We continue to offer hot food. We partnerships with a local restaurant, and what we would like to do is offer some partnership with having our young people, not just Black, but anyone that is in need to come together and do some environmental work, to do some work on how we can come together and change the world, brainstorm, grant writing, all of those different things are needed in an organization like ours. So
St. Matthew's Church.
St. Matthew's Church.
Okay.
That's 212-281-5433.
Okay. Hussein.
I will, since we're shouting out board membership, I'm on the board of the Interfaith Center for New York, which is, I think you pointed in that direction.
And Chloe's right there.
Chloe,
Stand
can
up,
you
Chloe.
raise your hand, please? Because I'm going to run away. You can talk to Chloe, who's the executive director. We do Marshall Myers Social Justice Retreat, the Interfaith Civic Leadership. We, of course, feed people, immigrant rights work. I could go on and on and on, but I will say we would please see Chloe after I leave or when we break, and she can give you all sorts of opportunities where you can volunteer through Interfaith Center.
And Dennis, did you get a chance to jump in? Okay.
Okay, so here are two very closely related questions that I think express a kind of perplexity that is therefore an opportunity for explication and a better understanding. And they're really directed towards something that Dr. Rashid had said. An admiration and an appreciation for everything that you said about the importance of recognizing the image of God. I don't think you used that term, but it's one that we would use, and I'm sure you would as well. The need for dignity and care and recognizing the rights of every human being, a recognition of that, and a perplexity as to how that pairs with a support for BDS, which the questioners believe is somehow getting to the rights of 40% of the Jewish population of the world.
Sorry, he's getting into the?
I'm sorry?
I missed the last part. That's getting into the?
That it affects the welfare of 40% of the Jewish population of the world, yeah.
I'm very conscious of the fact that BDS is a really loaded term. I was at an event last night that involved Palestinian peace activists, but Palestinian peace activists who were operating within Israel, and they were being boycotted by people on the basis of BDS.
Can you just unpack the acronyms?
Boycott, divestment, sanctions. This is a call for Palestinian activists that as long as Palestine is occupied, that there should be boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So a lot of what you're seeing on college campuses in terms of divestment comes out of the BDS campaign. So there are different stripes and flavors of BDS, and I don't want to unpack the whole thing right now, where my particular commitments are. But my commitments, broadly speaking, are towards avenues that work towards a just peace. So to hear that Palestinian peace activists were being boycotted last night because they were operating within Israel, I think, is a weird thing to be boycotting when it's Palestinian boys. So, you know, I think there are flavors to this. I don't think this is necessarily speaking to the questioner's question or intent behind it, but I'm also of an age where, you know, the South Africa boycott was an important part of my political identity. When we hear about, well, what about academic institutions, cultural institutions? That was also the questions when we were talking about South Africa. My office at Harvard runs a program in the West Bank. We work very closely with Palestinian and Israeli academics, but one of them was recently removed from her job before being reinstituted. You may be familiar with the name Nadira Shahub-Kevorkian. She's actually a fellow with our program. And she was removed from her position, a tenured position, was eventually reinstated, but I think it speaks to the idea that if we are serious about academic freedom, it has to start from the beginning, not at the end. And so these are the types of things that I'm invested in, and it's about knowing where certain policies will lead to and trying to preempt them rather than allowing them to happen and being reactive to them.
Thank you. This is about the way in which one conducts dialogue. So one questioner wanted to hear from panelists, whoever would like to answer, what your personal red lines are that you will not cross in dialogue. Engaging with conversation with someone who is just committed to anti-normalization, who just will feels that whatever your commitments are makes you ineligible for conversation. Is that something that cuts it off? And particularly to Rabbi Ruskay, an interest in your explicating a little more what you mean by no permanent friends in dialogue. Is this a rule, meaning we shouldn't trust anyone to always be there for us? Is it a motto that we don't always unconditionally have to be there for everyone else? What is this vision and experience about dialogue? So there are a number of things relating to how we conduct dialogue here.
I think I interpret it more as a remembering that even if somebody is against you on one particular issue, you shouldn't assume that you just never speak to each other. Like there actually might be moments where you would work very well together, and if you're gonna say, because there are some things we disagree about, that we can never work together, you're gonna be way less effective in trying to make change in the world. So I think it is more about, I think it is human nature to, if someone is really opposite you on something that matters tremendously to you, to think we don't work together. And it's an agitation to be open to working with people who make you mad on a range of other things. I think that I don't have red lines about dialogue. I think that ideas shouldn't be so scary to us. We might hate them, but if we make it that people can't say what they think, they're not going to not think it because they're not telling us. So it's better to be exposed to the idea and be very uncomfortable than not hear it at all. But I do get their social pressure to, like, if we say we don't talk to people who think that, maybe some people won't think that.
Father McManus, you got a red line?
I'm not sure if it's a red line. If I may, I look at Jesus in the gospel, and he spoke with everyone. There was no outside line for him. Even the Romans, who were the Nazis of their day, occupying Israel, he never said to them, you know, quite frankly, Centurion, if you'd just dump this pantheon of Roman gods you're involved with and get serious, we could. There are no conditions, except two that he invites them to, okay? The first is goodwill. And when people approach with goodwill, the possibility opens up for something. Dialogue for us is not about agreement. It's about goodwill and the opening to possibility. The second thing, I look at Jesus and I hear him say, It is about trust, which I've heard you say so many times. It's about trust. Trust in the ability of the two dialogue partners to open, trust to exchange of goodwill. These strike me as fundamentally human conditions. If those are not present, or I suspect deception, that would be a red line for me.
Lisa, do you have any red lines?
I don't have any red lines except those that harm my brother and sister. I think I cannot imagine any dialogue that is off limits when both individuals or parties of people come together with the intent of uplifting one another and humanity. And so any sort of dialogue that has the end goal of shifting humanity towards unity without harming anyone, I think is profitable for all.
Hussein?
I'll just echo what my panelists said. I think that you start conversations with people, and if it's obvious they're not invested in recognizing other people's humanity, that's a red line. But sometimes people just need to be heard before they can start listening.
I would have said before an experience I had that I had no red lines in dialogue. And then I found myself in Doha, in Qatar, at a dialogue event. And a Palestinian mufti, Taysir al-Tamimi, got up and began an anti-Israel rant. I expected that, and I had no problem sitting through it until his anti-Israel rant became an anti-Semitic rant. And since I was one of two Jews in the room, the other being my son, I took offense. And he was virulent. And I'm sitting there thinking, now what do I do? And I realized I don't have to be sitting here. And I got up and very visibly, I was right up in front, got up and walked out on him and told the organizers in Qatar that I felt betrayed. I had invited them here to this Jewish theological seminary. They came with what I thought was goodwill, and they put a man on the podium who they knew was an anti-Semite and didn't do anything about it. 3 years later, I was in Jordan for I was actually at Yale, not Jordan, but I was at Yale University. Those are different places.
It's an easy mistake.
Yes, people often confuse New Haven with Jordan. But you'll understand my mistake. And the same mufti got up and started ranting. But the chair of the event at Yale was a Jordanian prince, and Prince Ghazi walked to the front of the room, took the mufti by the arm and said, "You can't say that here," and walked him off the stage. And it was shocking to everyone, but necessary. And that's why I'm happy to mistake Yale for Jordan.
Okay. With a little trepidation, I'm going to read one more question. The trepidation is we do want to break, although I fear that we're getting a little overcast outside, but if we, so my phone tells me, we'd want to have a little time for the eclipse for those who would like to.
Last question.
But it's an interesting question, so that's why I'm going to do it. One of the lies that anti-Semitism tells us is that Jews are too white, too rich, too influential, too successful to ever be vulnerable. But history shows that the status of Jews is always hanging in the balance. So how did Jews begin the work required by the struggle to gain acceptance and therefore allyship with other marginalized groups that find themselves sometimes too tired to care about others because they're so absorbed with the problems that they themselves are facing?
Yeah, I'm just going to answer quickly because time is short and all three of my non-Jewish colleagues on the panel have used the word very pointedly, education. You need to be educating your own religious compatriots about the other. And that's why we have events like this at JTS, so you can hear from a Catholic, a Protestant, a Muslim. If you educate, and I have to say Dennis has been doing it forever as a professor of Jewish studies in Catholic seminaries. And if I fault to JTS at all, it's that we don't have enough world and time to make interreligious studies part of the core curriculum. But I'm very proud to say that we have, every year now, 5 Milstein Fellows who come to events, who learn, who will go out and teach, and who drag their colleagues along to events. So little by little, extracurricular, we are penetrating that. But I think education is the absolute core. Students need to know not only about Sunni Islam, but about Shiite Islam, and about the varieties of Protestant religion, and indeed even the varieties of Catholic expression. And I'll leave it to Stephanie to teach them about the varieties of Jewish expression.
But before Stephanie goes, can I just say with that education, I think also, because you can educate by instruction, but I think exposure, interaction are more important, because that's what's going to change the actual culture. You know, it's been said that you can have all the missions and goals that you want and even the education, but unless culture is changed, it's toxic. It's going to take you out, and it's going to take me out because you can't see it. It's there. And so this whole idea, you gave a number of characteristics for Jews. I know you mentioned wealthy. I forgot what the others were. Those are stereotypes. And we all fall victim to stereotypes. And so, you know, I know that those stereotypes exist, but I hear about them. But because I'm exposed to individuals, I know that those stereotypes are not true. And so we have to be exposed to individuals and interact with individuals so that we can break down those stereotypes, so that we can break down the unconscious biases that we see, that we experience every day. Not just blacks, but Jews and Muslims and other people that are not even represented here in this room, perhaps.
So if we wanted exposure, if we in the Jewish community wanted to visit St. Matthew's, and in visiting St. Matthew's, we would also be educating your congregants into the variety of Jewish expression. Is there a phone number we could call?
The phone number is 212-281-5433. You can reach us at www.sbcharlem.org.
Thank you.
I don't know what the skies are like now, but it is possible to go up to a second floor terrace. If you take the elevator at the front up to the second floor, there'll be a door that takes you out. And if you have cards that you haven't used, bring them to the next wonderful session starting at 3:45.